Good day and welcome to another Spotlight edition sponsored by the Mayor's Office of Black Male Engagement. A Spotlight series is where we highlight the good work that is being done by melanin-enriched men who are in the city of Philadelphia. We're very excited today to host a man who needs no introduction in many circles. His work is entrenched in therapeutic practice, and he's been tied and linked with the University of Pennsylvania. Definitely an excellent researcher, and someone who is connected to a larger project currently called the Forward Promise, and we'll learn more about that. We're very excited to have Dr. Howard Stevenson today. Generally in our spotlights, we ask three questions. Who are you? What do you do, and how does what you do impact men and boys of color in the city? So we'd like to start by asking those questions to Dr. Stevenson. And I'm a little nervous, and I've never been nervous about asking those three questions, but from a man, or asking the question to a man whose area of erudition, if you will, is steeped in deep psychological thought and practice, asking who are you might not necessarily be the safest question. So if you wouldn't mind just engaging us, indulging us in sort of the answer.
Sure.
To who are you? Give us a little bit about who you are, aside from the work that you do.
Well, thank you, Jack. I actually am honored to be here, and part of thinking about who am I, as you asked it, I thought professionally I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania. I direct a center called Racial Empowerment Collaborative, and we're interested in training, research, program development, and service to address issues of racial literacy. And in a nutshell, it's sort of how do you navigate those moments where you're overwhelmed by racial difference or conflict, and how do you navigate that? And so we're interested in teaching young people in fifth grade, for example, how to deal with the stress of being different. And we know, based on a lot of research, children are not immune to the impact of racism, and it affects their grades, it affects how they focus, it affects how they relate to other folks. So the center is focused on addressing those issues for fifth graders, parents, teachers, police, an adult. So, but my other who am I is I'm a father of two boys, 27-year-old and Brian, and my Julius, my 13-year-old. So that preoccupies the other half of my life in a lot of ways, because without them I wouldn't be who I am.
Absolutely. And I totally neglected to introduce our co-host here, who is the coordinator for the Office of Black Male Engagement, Mr. Octavius Blount, who's going to also engage in some of the questions as well.
Okay. I know you talked about rec and everything. I know there are certain projects that you've done as far as play, VR Us, and also another one called Shape Up, where you have barbershop talks. If you could give us an overview of those, that would be great, and what you do to impact black men and the community.
Well, play is probably the most fun project. It stands for Preventing Long-Term Anger and Aggression in Youth, and it's a project where since 1999 we started in a discipline school in West Philly, and we worked with about 300 boys, almost 400 across 4 years in a discipline school, 4 days a week, about 3 hours each day, and sort of cut our teeth on developing intervention where you could use basketball and therapy, group therapy at the same time, with the idea that young people, black males in particular, struggle through moments of conflict, and figuring out how they problem solve those conflicts in less than a minute or two was part of the thing. And so basketball is a place where some guys, whether they're talented or not, right, there's a place in which a conflict could occur where it could be related to some social conflict or disagreement, but sometimes it's about the fact, when our ideal of our talent clashes with the reality of our talent. We think we're better than we really are. People talk trash, they get on your back. And so those are great places for us to see how the boys navigate those stressors, because how they navigate those on the court reflect how they do it in the classroom, on the street corner. So play was meant to see if we could follow kids, teach them skills around navigating that, teach them about racial literacy and culture. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a black man? What does it mean to be a black child that's not ready for manhood, for example?
Okay.
And then include parents in the process. And so that model we've used not only in for young people in play, but for African American men in the barbershop. So Shape Up is around with the help of colleagues Loretta Jamont, John Jamont at Penn and Drexel. Very great colleagues who've done amazing work around HIV and AIDS for several decades. We teamed up, trained barbers on how to become health educators around HIV, sexual risk reduction. That was their area. My area was on violence retaliation reduction, because retaliation is the primary way in which, pain and trauma comes out and acted out in violence. And so barbers are just fantastic. Black barbers especially. They got a style about them. They got an attitude. When you're in a barber's chair, you're a captive audience, right? And we learned from the men, about 680 black men over 4 years we studied, that they said to us that they trust a black barber and will share something very personal with a black barber that they won't share with a partner or a religious leader.
That's true.
Wow.
And so
That's true.
in that way, not only do you have barbers who share knowledge but listen, you also can teach them how to navigate, how do you problem solve in a relationship with a partner, making choices that are protecting yourself or not reacting when somebody disrespects you. So that's what Shape Up was about, and we're still writing up, but we learned a lot of powerful things. Barbershops are some of the most consistent institutions in the community. And barbers tell us they've been around for 20, 30 years. Some churches leave, some community, other service industries leave. And then the other project, Virus, was meant to think about, how do you, with community health providers in ER rooms. We work with clergy at HUP and watch how they cared for families of mostly young men who were shot. And so part of our training was to deal with the trauma of that, bringing in families, teaching them about racial literacy, the same model, but for clergy, working with mostly folks of color, and having children talk about what it's like to be different in the world with their parents, and parents vice versa.
Okay.
And in the same way, asking parents to share their trauma with their kids. The kids want to know what's it like for you to navigate trauma, racial trauma. How did you navigate your childhood while I'm going through my childhood? So part of it was to get religious leaders out of their roles and become, parents, not leaders, and kids to be able to step up and say, here's what's really going on with us in our particular valley. So, those would be summary.
That emphasis on children is very important, and that leads into our next question. We generally talk about impact, and I know you alluded to impact in your answer, but one thing that kind of stuck out to me is this focus on children. I noticed that we're learning that in literature, children are becoming traumatized earlier and earlier, especially when you take into consideration education or one's educational trajectory. I read somewhere recently that there's a large contingent of black boys who are suspended and expelled from institutions even before they, reach the K-12 world.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about sort of the psychological implications of, that impact young people throughout, their development, and sort of how, that impacts their lives?
Oh, absolutely important. So part of the way people think about racism is we tend to think of it as an ideology or belief system, who will vote for, what are rights, in a legal sort of frame, right? That we want to have a country of laws that are protective for everybody and equitable and equal. But when we think about racism, we think about it more around emotional, sort of traumatic reality. So you could get a law that protects people, but it's usually to apply after something's wrong has occurred. the trauma, legal sort of remedies around race will not address the trauma and emotional stuff that happens daily. And so children, they are sort of the place where all the stuff falls down on them. And so if you look at the preschool expulsion data, and a friend of mine, Walter Gilliam out of Yale, has been doing this research since 2005, we've known since 2005 that black boys are more likely to be expelled in preschool.
Yes.
And his definition about this is not a child problem. It's an adult fear of these children.
Absolutely.
And so racism as a fear of some difference is a better way to understand how it impacts our children as young as 3 and 4. But also, we have known in the last 10 years there's been an increase of suicide rates for black boys and black from 5 to 12. And that's not happened since we've been keeping stats around suicide.
Wow.
Right? We've always known there's been a white-black difference where whites are more likely across all age groups to attempt suicide. But that has changed in the last decade. So we got to think about trauma and what's particularly traumatic for black youth earlier than we ever wanted to. And so, yeah, we want to push childhood, the appreciation of child development, not growing up before your time, understanding how dehumanization in the world works when adults, professionals, police officers, teachers see a 5-year-old as a 12-year-old, or see a 12-year-old as an 18-year-old. That's a form of dehumanization. It's a form of racial dehumanization. And even what we're seeing at the border with Central American and Mexican families being separated from each other, it's not unlike our history of enslavement in which families were separated, and the consequences are intergenerational. So not seeing children as children is a big marker for racism, colonialization, and a threat that we need to address.
So we generally end by asking you for a couple of words of advice for our listening audience, for our viewing audience, and just some words of wisdom, if you will.
Well, the proverb I've been using for 30 years is: "The lion's story will never be known as long as the hunter is the one to tell it." And for all the young people, and I enjoy spending more time with young people than just creating programs, because the way in which our young people are underestimated, young people of color are stressed out. What they need is time to tell their narrative and stories. And part of our work is seeing how they can become empowered by what's already around them, what they have within inside of them, what they have in their families, what they have in their communities, and not let anybody else tell their story, right? And part of the beauty of watching young people come to an awareness that they can decide what's going on for them and not letting others, the kind of comeback lines that are brilliant from these children are both funny, cultural, and protective, in ways where they become, the script writers instead of, following other folks' scripts. So that proverb has meant a lot for us, and how we do our work, but also hopefully to young people that, you and your cultures, are very meaningful, and don't be ashamed of it.
Absolutely. Well, Doc, we want to thank you so much for your contribution and your time today. And Octavius, thank you so much for co-hosting. This has been a great experience. We've learned a lot. And we invite you back to another Spotlight series, and we hope to see you in the future. Thank you.